Pokémon is a phenomenon. All over the world, people seek to catch them all and do battle with their pocket monsters. And while Pokémon is more popular today than ever, I don't think it will ever match the frenzied, maniacal peak of the late 90s. For those that remember, it was a weird and wonderful time. From enjoying the legendary manga, including that incredible first movie that was just such an unbelievable event, to spending every penny we could get our grubby little mitts on assembling the ultimate deck of Pokémon cards, and getting so excited by them that our schools banned us from bringing them in, and of course that we all now regret losing or giving away. But all of this began with a couple of modest little cartridges for what was arguably the single greatest handheld gaming phenomenon in history. And for those that were there, the adventure of playing Pokémon on the Nintendo Game Boy will remain up there with the most classic of our childhood memories. And this is the story of how those memories came to be. This all began in 1996 with a quaint Japanese RPG called Pocket Monsters, which of course made its way west. Pokémon Red and Blue released on Nintendo's Game Boy in 1998 and began a saga that would last until today. The Game Boy is legendary, and as was the case with all video game technology of the day, the extremely limited hardware capabilities meant that manufacturers had to be highly selective about the features they included in their platforms. Today, as hardware has become exponentially more powerful, many tasks that were once handled by bespoke chips are now consolidated onto the CPU or GPU. This need to pick and choose features meant that every game system had its own flavor and personality. And this was true of no system more than the Game Boy. The idea of releasing a handheld gaming system in 1989 still blows my mind. Even for the time, the Game Boy was a low-powered device, one that was designed to be affordable and offer exceptional battery life. It featured a custom Sharp CPU that was clocked at 4.2 megahertz. It had 8 kilobytes of memory and 8 kilobytes of video memory. This was significantly less than even the Atari Lynx that released the same year. Its screen was a 160 by 144 dot matrix LCD, where each pixel had its own liquid crystal structure, acting like a kind of light valve. As more voltage is applied to this structure, it prevents more and more light from passing through, and this is how we get the Game Boy's 4 colors. Now just think about that. 160 by 144 resolution means 23,040 individual pixels, with each of those pixels having its own crystal structure, dynamically adjusting its voltage in order to bring your game to life. Every single Game Boy had this. And with a refresh rate of 59.7 Hz, the screen was updating nearly 1.37 million pixels every single second. And this was on a handheld device released in 1989. But the truly elegant design of the Game Boy is demonstrated when considering how images were displayed on this screen. The Game Boy used a tile-based display system. Instead of redrawing the entire screen every frame, the system worked with small 8 by 8 pixel tiles that could be repositioned, swapped, or modified independently. It also had dedicated sprite hardware, built-in support for scrolling background layers, and a window layer. This clever approach maximized performance while keeping power consumption low. It's almost as if every aspect of the Game Boy fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. And this low-powered hardware configuration meant that a single batch of 4 AA's would land us with 30 hours of playtime. And while the brute power of the Game Boy was objectively low even for the time, the sheer brilliance of its overall design meant that when the technology was in the hands of people that knew what they were doing, magic ensued. It does not get any more classic than Super Mario Land. And this game is still an absolute joy to play, even today. Rather than downport the Super Mario Bros. Game from the NES to the Game Boy, Nintendo created an original Mario game that was a microscopic 32 kilobytes in size. I cannot even fathom it. Just consider the development team, creating the levels, sprites, music, etc., and having to work within a 32 kilobyte budget. It's just insane. But due to the technical nature of the Game Boy, staying within this budget at the time was absolutely critical. But soon after release, Nintendo introduced its mapper chip, which allowed something called bank switching, and it changed everything for Game Boy games. Here's a visual demonstration of how this works. No matter how big the game is, the CPU could only ever see these two 16 kilobyte banks on the cartridge. Bank 0 was static, meaning the data in it could not be manipulated or changed. It was always the same. Whereas the data in Bank 1 could be swapped out as needed. So the MBC could take that 16 kilobyte block of data out of Bank 1 and switch it with a different bank of data as needed. And because this meant that the entire game no longer needed to be crammed into those two 16 kilobyte banks, magical things began to happen. 3 years after Super Mario Land had come out, its sequel, Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins, appeared at a whopping 512 kilobytes, and it offered a generational leap in fidelity and gameplay. Only because of the power of bank switching, this generational leap was achieved on the same system. The cartridge integrated Nintendo's first generation mapper chip, the MBC1, to manage the aforementioned bank switching, and wow. When sitting down to capture the footage for this video, I was having a great time with the original Super Mario Land. But when I fired up its sequel, it's no exaggeration to say that playing this game again blew me away. Seeing the evolution from the first Super Mario Land to this, the scale, the graphics, the levels, the sprites, the physics, the music. But this has to go down as one of the absolute greatest sequels of all time, and showcases, once again, how meager hardware, well designed, can achieve seemingly impossible feats when in the right hands. And speaking of music on the Game Boy, it was no slouch in that department either. Its audio processor had 4 channels, 2 square waves, 1 programmable waveform, and 1 noise channel. It had a mono speaker, but plug headphones in, and the Game Boy would output beautiful stereo sound. And it also had support for some basic effects, further heightening its creative and emotional potential. And as was the case with other technical aspects of the Game Boy, it was objectively weak when compared to other platforms, but when in the hands of a master, extraordinary things happened. I mean, just take a look at this. This is a beautiful presentation. Ninja Gaiden really is the Game Boy at its best. And just listen to that music. But the hardware capability itself was only half the story. The form factor was as critical to the Game Boy experience as anything else. Suddenly, rather than being tethered to a TV, we were free to play our games on the go. This portability was a fundamental component of what elevated the Game Boy to its legendary status, and the key to the nostalgia and joy we all feel when thinking back to our time with this incredible game system. Whether it was making ourselves feel sick playing it in the car, or hiding it under our bed sheets with a torch so that we could play it after we were supposed to have gone to bed. Now, where we were, what we were doing while playing the game combined to create the most powerful memories. So what would happen then when the ultimate adventure was released on this legendary handheld and we got to experience a quest for the ages wherever and whenever we wanted? For a while, I had to look on with envy as my friends set off on their respective Pokémon journeys. So it was a very special day when my father took me and my brother to Comet and bought us each a Game Boy Color and a copy of Pokémon. The Game Boy Color was released almost 10 years after the original and featured a number of enhancements. Most notable was, of course, the color display, a major upgrade from the quaint dot matrix screen in the original device, though it still, of course, lacked a backlight. But it also featured a more powerful CPU, more memory, and support for larger cartridges and Game Boy Color only games, but all while maintaining complete backwards compatibility for original Game Boy games. I have had some of the greatest, most satisfying gaming experiences of my entire life on this extraordinary machine, including the most underrated Metal Gear Solid game of all time. A game I still can't get over, just how deep and varied the experience was. It was absolutely one of the best gameplay experiences from my childhood. I love Metal Gear Solid on Game Boy Color. And I also had the pleasure of experiencing one of the greatest Zelda games Nintendo ever created, with Link's Awakening DX. And of course the DX version included full color support. But for me, all of this began with Pokémon Blue. My excitement was off the charts, but I could never have truly anticipated the scale of the adventure that lay before me. There was nothing, absolutely nothing on the scale, nor with the presentation of Pokémon Red and Blue. And after firing it up, nothing would ever be the same. Simply iconic. After selecting new game, we are briefed by Professor Oak. He gives us our mission to set forth and complete our Pokédex. He invites us to make a choice that for some will be definitive in our lives, selecting our starter Pokémon. I chose Squirtle and invariably chose the water type in every subsequent game. And even this initial decision has a significant impact on the experience we will have throughout the game. And having made it, we set out on an adventure that will never be forgotten. The basic gameplay loop is classic. Use your Pokémon to fight other Pokémon so that they get stronger, so that you can then beat stronger Pokémon still. It was simple, easy to grasp, and deployed in the most incredible way. It had tons of depth. There were 150 Pokémon with different moves, different types, different personalities. There was so much variety. Each one had their own sprite, their own cry, and could be found at different points throughout the game. And we all had our favorites. And as we set forth across the Kanto region to create our story, we would begin to learn that some types of Pokémon are particularly strong or weak against other types. We start to acquire and deploy items to aid in our battles and our quest. And as we catch more Pokémon, learn about them as well, we gradually begin to intuit the systems at work in the game as we inch ever closer towards becoming a Pokémon master. We build out our own roster of Pokémon and develop strategies that align with that particular selection of Pokémon. For some, that might have one insanely strong member and a swath of weaker compatriots. Or maybe you have a 90s Chicago Bulls lineup of superstars. The beauty is, it's your choice, and you create the lineup that you want. Throughout this adventure, we pass through all number of towns, battling the local gym leaders, notably Brock and Misty, of course. We explore all manner of forests and caves. We board and explore the SS Anne, perhaps intentionally blacking out after acquiring Cut, nudge nudge wink wink. We get a bicycle, do battle with Team Rocket, explore their base under the casino in Celadon City, and defeat the big cheese, Giovanni. We then go about helping the Marowak in the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, freeing her spirit. We get the Poker Flute so that we can wake Snorlax and get him out the way. We spend time exploring the Safari Zone, and that in itself was such an amazing part of the game. For some reason, there was just something about it, that indefinable magic, and exploring it was one of the absolute highlights of this adventure. And of course, in the Safari Zone, we find those beautiful gold teeth and HM03 Surf, and the HM moves themselves are critical because there is backtracking, and as you acquire more abilities, you can go back and discover more of the game that you weren't able to access in the beginning. There are the 3 legendary Pokemon with Zapdos, Articuno and Moltres to find. There was Mewtwo and, of course, Mew. It was just such an insanely rich and developed world with a magnificent story and lore, with so much to do and so much to explore. Random people would offer you useful information, Pokemon trades, or even items, and it really felt like there was something to discover around every corner. And all paths, of course, lead to Victory Road. We ultimately arrive at the Elite Four, a group of the strongest trainers in all of Kanto. The final test to become a Pokemon Master. And all the way through this journey, we are being treated to one of the grandest presentations on the Game Boy. The bank switching made possible by the aforementioned MBC1 chip meant that Pokemon Red and Blue were an astronomical 1 megabyte in size. This meant a huge world to explore, loads of sprites, loads of characters, loads of dialogue. It meant an extraordinary variety of timeless, classic Game Boy music, from this legendary tune to the heart-racing music that popped in every time you were spotted by a trainer. And our heart rate was increased even more by this tune that played every time we entered a battle. And for those that were there, these pieces of music will be with us forever. Now, a fundamental aspect of the Pokemon game design was their presence on Game Boy and not a different platform. This quest was designed to be undertaken on the go, and it's another aspect of its profound emotional power. One of my absolute best childhood memories is being at the Riverdart Holiday Park in Devon, in the UK, in our beaten up old Volkswagen Transporter, as the rain was pouring down outside. I was sat in the top part with my mate Jacob, and we were playing Pokemon on our Game Boys as my mother was cooking us beans and sausages down below. Honestly, it doesn't get any better than that. And as we were up there, in the warm and protected from the rain, and after much pleading, Jacob shared with me a secret knowledge, a power so great that it would fundamentally change how we experienced the game, how to trigger missing number, and how to attain infinite rare candies. It's another aspect of this experience that simply will not ever be repeated. While the internet, of course, existed at the time, and we had sites like Game Winners and Game FAQs, It wasn't like today where it's almost impossible for any mystery to exist about any game. Back in the day, missing number, or missingno as I called it, was sacred knowledge. And when Jacob agreed to share it with me, it felt as such. Now, if you combine all of these disparate elements that we've just gone through into a singular experience, you end up with a powerful emotional connection that is rekindled every time one thinks back to or revisits these incredible games. And that is their greatness. But little did I know, this was just the beginning. Nintendo and the Pokémon Company have a long history of releasing different versions of what is, fundamentally, the same game. And following Red and Blue, they gave us Pokémon Yellow. Released with Game Boy Color support, and to more closely resemble the story and look of the now insanely popular manga, it was a phenomenal experience. One of the biggest differences I remember is, of course, starting with Pikachu as your first Pokemon, with that incredible PSG sample, and eventually accumulating all the original starter Pokemon, as Ash does in the cartoon. It was a rich, vibrant adventure, and it was a pleasure to make my way through Kanto once more. Pokemon Yellow was the first game in which I really did catch 'em all, excluding Mew. And I proudly had 150 out of 150 Pokemon in my Pokédex. Achieving this was not as simple as playing the game for hundreds and hundreds of hours, as the different versions of the game, i.e. Red, Blue, Yellow, had Pokemon that were unique to that version. And this was possible due to another legendary feature of the Game Boy, the link cable, which facilitated trading Pokemon with your friends and, of course, doing battle with them. This feature was such a joy back in the day because of these incredible experiences that it made possible. The Game Boy, I mean, just what a system. And this amazing feature, magnificently integrated into the outstanding game design, meant that completing your Pokemon quest was something that you had to do in real life. Once again demonstrating that these truly were Game Boy games. I could not fathom how it could possibly get better. But then one day, seeing this commercial for Pokemon Gold blew my mind. I'm not a completionist, but I had truly wrung that Gen 1 sponge completely dry. And I could not fathom the sheer magnitude of what lay before me when I began the once-in-a-generation experience that was Pokemon Gold. What is there to say about this game that hasn't already been said? It's a masterpiece, a true sequel. And with the MBC3 chip on board, Pokemon Gold was a universe-shattering 2 megabytes in size, where every single aspect of it is that much better than the games that came before. With more to do, more to see, more Pokemon to catch. And wow, what an adventure Pokemon Gold would turn out to be. And after having, once again, defeated the Elite Four and completed the Pokemon League, we sat back dazed by the journey that had just come to an end. Our Gen 2 Pokemon quest complete. Or was it? As I intimated earlier on, we were still in the pre-Twitter, pre-YouTube era of the internet. And thus, when it came to games, there were many secrets and much mystery remained. And so it was, having completed this most extraordinary adventure, I returned home to New Barktown. As I was walking around, I noticed some water that I would not have been able to traverse at the beginning of the game, but now, all-powerful, I eagerly surfed across it to see what was on the other side. And I discovered a seemingly unremarkable cave. And little did I know that this cave possessed a secret that would lead me to having one of the most emotionally powerful gaming moments of my entire life. Making my way through the cave, nothing, absolutely nothing, would prepare me for what I was about to discover. I found the exit. I stepped through. I was speechless. To my sheer amazement and incredulity, I had arrived back in Kanto. I was overwhelmed. Was this really happening? How was this possible? I had just completed one of the most astonishing adventures that I would ever have in gaming. And the entirety of the previous game was here the whole time, waiting for me to come back and discover. And once I had come to terms with what the developers had achieved, I set off once again through Kanto, and I had an extraordinary time. And I must take a moment to praise the work of the late Satoru Iwata. We all know him as the former CEO of Nintendo. But whilst he was working at HAL Laboratory, he developed the compression technology that made it possible to fit both Pokémon regions of Kanto and Johto into the gold and silver cartridges. Had he not done so, we would not have been able to experience this definitive moment. So I just wanted to say, arigato, Iwata-san. And after having traversed Kanto, having defeated all 8 gym leaders once again, and believing the game to finally be complete, Pokémon Gold had one more moment in store for us. Upon returning to Professor Oak, he grants us access to Mount Silver. But upon reaching its summit, nothing could prepare us for who was waiting there. Standing perfectly still and saying nothing was Red. The character you play as in the first generation of Pokémon games is the final boss in this one. To call this encounter epic is to undersell it. It was the perfect culmination of the ultimate adventure. The battle was extraordinarily difficult, and to succeed, you really did have to be a master. But once completed, Pokémon Gold does what it always set out to. Not only does it tell you that you're a Pokémon master, it has successfully made us feel that we were a Pokémon master. For me, Pokémon Gold and Silver were the absolute pinnacle of the Pokémon games. Afterwards, I did play Pokémon Ruby on Game Boy Advance. Though it never quite clicked like Gold did, it was another fantastic game on another legendary Nintendo handheld, but I did fall off the series after that. And for this slightly aged gamer, it is Pokémon Gold that will likely remain atop the mantle as the Pokegoat and one of the greatest video games I have ever played. This video was a story about games and the systems we play them on. It was about memories, about experiences, and the impact they have on us even decades after having had them. These games, these tiny bundles of code and silicon, and the technology that enables us to experience them, they become part of our story, who we are. And it's a testament to the creativity, passion, and the hard work of the developers who unknowingly give us one of the greatest gifts we could possibly imagine. Well, thank you very much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the Game Boy and Pokemon. Of course, I would love it if you could share your Pokemon game memories down in the comments, and I'll be delighted to read and respond to them. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking it, as it does help the channel a lot. And if you would like to see more videos on cool, awesome stuff, including video games, movies, pizza, please consider subscribing to the channel, as we're just getting started, baby. So once again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.